So, welcome everybody to the path of Yud. We are very well on our way to getting through the entire tree of life. So how is everybody doing? It's been about a month since we actually had a get together because of my networking problem and then scheduling problems. So everyone has had plenty of time to work on the path of Kaf, and I'd like to hear what people's experiences have been. Has anyone worked on the path of Kaf? Kaf? Robin said mine again has been most balancing. And what do you mean by that? Balancing the inner elements inside of yourself? Juan says very well, most goals have been met and many of the path workings have provided a great deal of guidance along the way. Terrific. No thoughts on the path of Kaf itself though, Juan? Alex says very interesting in the sense of being able to release, but also in a waking up sense. Brendine says, Kevin says, first time I saw visions of animals being castrated. I'm not sure what that means, but Robin says, inner and outer life seems to be balancing within and without. Quite interesting, really. Excellent. Kevin says, second time I saw unity with all things. Wonderful. I wonder what the animals being castrated meant to you, though. Alex says, I mean waking up to the way in which certain personality traits cause a bouncing back and forth in a way that causes subjective pain. Which personality traits are you talking about? Kevin is also wondering what those castrated animals mean. I mean, castration is a sense of having one's manhood taken away, or having one's really one's identity and sense of self taken away in a sense, since it's our ability to move our genes into another life. Additionally, an animal would tend to mean that sort of like on a vegetable or a very sort of fundamental biological level that fear is happening, and perhaps even depending on the animal, a sense of being not in control of oneself. Juan says, I had an odd trip with Kaf in that I kept finding myself in darkness and with echoes around me. Could not really make them out, and they were not dizzying, just annoying. Could not keep a focus. Alright guys, sorry for that brief pause. I think it'll be alright as long as you guys are patient with just a brief pause every once in a while. So, where I was last, Alex says, I mean subjective likes and dislikes, also attachment to outcomes. Okay, that makes a lot of sense. Kevin says the animals were pigs, cows, and horses. So yeah, those are sort of domesticated animals, meaning like feeling enslaved in a way. Juan says there was also a vivid feeling of fatherly protection. That's why I never... Hello, everybody. Sorry about that. A little bit longer than usual. I just broke my one of my electronic devices here in the process of trying to fix this thing. Okay. You guys were having quite a long conversation. Let me just catch up with you guys. There's also a vivid sense of fatherly protection. That's why I never freaked out in the dark. Could Kevin's animal castration mean he's coming in better contact with his female side? It's possible. There's a request for patience. That's a really interesting one because it's very different in content but similar in theme to my experiences. One asks, I'm wondering if I'm not having quite all of the things that have been said here. Sense that all these things which vibrate back and forth so strongly are not actually anything to be afraid of. Oh my goodness. There's a sense of maybe you guys are having a little trouble staying awake during some of these. Well, certainly, I have to say, one of the things that's going on with them is that you're having a much longer entrance into them because you're going through each of the previous Sephirotic layers before you get to them. So that's going to change the dynamic of things and make you in a somewhat deeper state of, a deeper altered state. And that's going to affect things. You guys are giving each other some advice on staying alert, and that's good. Checking out my book, The Book of Magic Power, Juan suggests. Another person suggested having a fan on. That's a good way of keeping, the temperature at a reasonable rate and a little bit of physical stimulation on yourself. And so, in terms of the content of your experiences, though, I'm wondering how you guys felt the entrance to Chesed was. As the next two paths also have that same thing. Alright, so you guys were having an interesting conversation. And now I just want to let you know, I'm not turning the camera on, but we may still get cut off again because I am still seeming to have some problems, and I'm not sure exactly what it is at this point, as I have replaced the modem, which I was told was what the problem was. So I'll have to continue looking into the situation and maybe actually replace the router too. So it's funny that you say duct taping Jason to audio, since I actually have my microphone attached with some tape to the computer here right now, so they won't wiggle around. Very psychic of you. So at any rate, you guys were having an interesting conversation about visualization and challenges that you guys some of you are having with visualization in various states of consciousness. And with these pathworkings in particular, I think the most important thing is for you to move your consciousness along the line that's being suggested, rather than any specific need to visualize in any great detail what's being discussed. As long as you're following along with the material, that's the most important part of it. As in many ways, they're sort of life lessons that are being shared in a somewhat story form. But that being said, some of you, I know Juan often describes some fairly detailed visions that don't actually have anything to do with the recordings per se, and that's fine too. If you're being led by your consciousness off in new directions. I just want to check in and make sure everyone's still hearing me, because I haven't noticed any activity in the chat window for a couple of minutes. Okay, great. With specific reference to the Path of Kaf, the real purpose of it was for you to see that and I think Alex kind of defined this pretty well, that the various components of your personality and the various things that you experience in your life pull you in various directions, sometimes violently, sometimes subtly, and that is when you move to the center and you're no longer involving yourself in those movements of consciousness, suddenly you discover that there's a profound peace, and that's really my intention for you with that particular recording. And all of the ones that lead into Chesed, the purpose is to move into a space of love that really isn't about an other, so much as it is just simply a space of pure, just unfolding love. The other really is the Tiphereth space, where we are connecting specifically with ourself, with our innermost self, or with our angel, or however we want to come up with the metaphor, the beloved, the universe. Whereas in Chesed, we're more realizing that we are that expression outward, and that we're self-creating, and so the loving feeling is just flowing out into creation. Not specifically to create anything, but just that it's flowing outward, and so we are in a completely peaceful place. And so that's really the purpose of that recording, the Kaf recording, and also the next two that also deal with this Chesed space, each in their own way. And so, in terms of the path of Yod, as we're exploring it in these recordings, at first glance, it may actually seem sort of like a pretty basic instruction when you go through it. I don't know how many of you may have listened to it yet, but it basically is a story of wandering in the wilderness, of moving along the path and having various kinds of temptations confront you. And so in that way, it's quite similar to, say, the biblical story of Jesus in the wilderness, or the story of the Buddha sitting under the Bodhi tree, where we deal with the various kinds of temptations to swerve from the path, and without making it a moral thing. There's basic ways in which our consciousness tends to reach outward towards the images and the constructs that we create for ourselves of what we think would make for a good life, or what we think would make for it a pleasurable experience in the moment. And there's nothing wrong with those things as long as we aren't ensnared by them. And so this next path is really about recognizing that the things that we are feeling drawn towards aren't really going to ensnare us anymore, as we're moving more towards that space of loving outward flowing, rather than the space of needing. And so it's a fairly simple path in some ways, but I think that it's quite profound in the way that you approach it. If you approach it from a place of really ultimately kind of letting go of concern for the outer matters of life, and it again, it's without judgment or without a moral. Hello, Mariana. Just to let you know, I'm not turning on the camera just because I think it was causing problems with the networking, so I'm leaving it off. And at least, knock on wood, for the moment, I seem to be staying on for the time being while not using it. So, yes, Kevin, it's a journey into the wilderness, but not simply just letting go of the world, but realizing that the things of the world are okay, and they can be had or not had, but no longer feeling as compelled toward them as we were, and it's more a realization of this rather than a struggle with it, and just a recognition of that direction in life. Sure, and that is something that is a part of each one of the recordings to an extent, and so this particular path is about acknowledging that and acknowledging the change in direction that has been taking place within you, really since the entry into the Tiphereth path and the moving past that point, which is moving past a need to impress the world with one's accomplishments or to gratify one's sense pleasures instantaneously. It's not saying that those things aren't still a component of consciousness. They're just no longer the chief component, the chief thing that is running your life. To pretend that they aren't there is to, it's really to court being self-deceptive. But to acknowledge that those things are not pulling on us in the same way that they were before. They're still a presence. Everybody wants to be comfortable and the lack of and be happy and feel loved. Not wanting those things would indicate a problem in one's mental structures. But it's being compelled by those things to the point of being irresponsible that we are letting go of and we're moving past. Does that make sense to everybody? Brendine's talking about a change in direction, noticing an absence of that part of me. No more connection or desire for that part is gone. It's like it dissolves within me. Yes. And Robin says, for me, it's been competitiveness and control that has been getting let go of. And there's various people kind of agreeing with that notion or agreeing with the fact that they understand me anyway. So the impulses may come and go in your consciousness, and I don't want you to feel like you've made a mistake or a misstep if they should happen to reassert themselves in some way. There's nothing wrong with that. Those impulses are not really your own. They're just simply a part of consciousness that's flowing through you. Being awake to them dissipates their power when they reassert themselves. So, just be aware of that. And it's kind of fun. This is interesting because I sent out two emails recently due to our technical problems. We've actually got a couple of new people on here that weren't here before, I think. So that's wonderful. So it was actually kind of a blessing that we were having such a big problem. And welcome to you guys who are here. Robin said, like you said, Jason, these two things no longer seem to have a strong pull on me or ensnare me. Yeah, and so this path, the path of Yod, the path of the hermit, is in many ways in these recordings, and this is true of most of the recordings from here on in. They're not so much psychodramas the way that the earlier recordings were. They're almost sort of acknowledgments and just a flowing towards the things that you're moving towards now. That they're not they don't require you to drop away quite as much, but just simply to kind of orient yourself in new directions. And so it's interesting. And I'm glad to hear that you guys are getting some success with those things. Now, for those of you who have never attended one of these before, I'd love to have you come each time and join the discussion. We're basically working with my recordings for the 22 paths on the Tree of Life, and so we're at the, I think it's the 11th path right now, or the 10th of them, and it is. And so we're a little over halfway through, but that doesn't mean that you can't attend. And one of these days, I'm actually going to manage to get the recordings of the other ones up on the internet. It's become a little bit more challenging because the the host of these meetings is no longer allowing me to record them directly as we're going, so I'm actually using a recording software. But the people who have been working through these recordings have been getting a lot of success from them, and so I'd love for you guys to participate in that process. And you'll always be a bit behind where they are, but there's no reason not to come and participate in the conversation anyway, because it's really quite useful. Brendine says that she's having tremendous success with things just dissolving without a struggle, and Robin says very freeing. Yes, and there's some agreement on that fact going along. So, Robin says the classes Jason gives us tons of good verbal info. Yeah, I mean, I think that in some ways I've created a large number of recordings in the past few years that are kind of interrelated to one another. The Pathworkings and the newer New Hermetics recordings, and the angelic invocations and the goetic and spirit evocation recordings. They're all sort of related to one another, and they can intermingle with each other usefully, but there isn't really an instruction manual for them. So these classes are sort of becoming a bit of an instruction manual for those recordings, so that you can use them a bit more consciously and a bit more conscientiously. So Brendine says, they help tremendously with insight, and group pulling things together seems to solidify experiences and outcomes. Sure, and usually when people are having a problem with something, it's a problem that more than one person is having. You know, people struggling with concentration, or struggling with finding the psychological questions that the path brings up challenging in various ways. There's usually more than one person who's experiencing that, and so it's useful to gather together. And since I have, we've kind of taken a little bit of a deviation from the topic. I've kind of been thinking over the past couple of days, since we are getting towards the end of these path workings, that one of the things I might like to do is have us continue forward and actually go through the New Hermetics tools. And one of the things that I think might be useful in that is actually going through the New Hermetics tools and comparing them and amplifying them by looking at some of the other magical and mystical tools that are out there, and just kind of making a comparative run through things and trying different things on. Because I mean, my intention with the New Hermetics tools was always that they were meant to be kind of like a way of looking at things that would simplify stuff, but there's a lot of different variations that I think are also useful out there, and sometimes even better than the ones that I've originally put out. So it looks like some people are saying that they definitely like to come for that. So we'll consider that once we get through these path workings. We'll begin that. Juan says, I like to think that we have each been wanting that from you, my brother. Yeah, I mean, I think that people have been asking me to do that for quite some time, but doing this pathworking class has really made it seem like that's possible. Of course, I will have to get my my computer situation sorted out before we can probably do that very safely, and I might want to do that on Uvu or some other thing rather than any meeting, as any meeting seems to be creating a lot of problems lately. But so back to the path of Yod, which is the path of the hermit in the tarot. Well, okay, just one more thing. Juan's asking if he can share it with his friends, and absolutely, Juan, please do. And so that would probably be starting in September or October, depending on when we get through the rest of these. I'd like to try and get these down to more of a weekly class. because I don't think I'm working any Sundays in August, although I do sometimes get called in at the last minute. So anyway, the path of the hermit is a path of obviously the hermit suggests isolation and solitariness, but and to an extent, at least the beginning of the path is that way. You know, you're in Tiphereth, so you're starting from a place of fusion and connection, and then you somewhat lose that in moving forward, and you actually begin to feel more isolated and more alone. And that's simply because the sense of fusion can't continue indefinitely. And so there's always the other side of it, in which it's rather like a love affair. You know, if you meet someone and you fall deeply in love and the two of you are together, there comes a point, no matter how long you spend together in that love, there comes a point when you need to separate for a time. And that can be very painful. And so you guys are continuing to have chit chats on the bottom of the screen, and so anyway, you separate from the beloved, and at that point you can feel quite alone and quite anxious and wanting to connect again, and that's kind of where the path of the hermit begins, or the path of Yod, as we are exploring it through the kind of the metaphor of the hermit, and then it is a wandering through the wilderness, seeking to find it again. And the thing is, you can never find it again. You can, but moving forward, finding it again in the same way that you found it in that fusion moment isn't really forward progress. It's simply at that point can become an addiction to bliss, or an addiction to feeling connected and happy, and that in and of itself can become less useful. I'm just going to examine what people are saying down here. Michael says absence makes the heart grow fonder. Brendan says fusion is not permanent. I'm sorry, you talking about fusion with beloved, HGA, or well, the sense of fusion is impermanent. But then again, Brendine is impermanent. Juan is impermanent. Jason is impermanent. All of those things are impermanent things. The HGA is impermanent. It's a concept. The HGA did not exist 150 years ago. At least not in the form that people think of it today. So, what eventually happens is something different, Brendine, than simply fusion. But the sense of fusion, the sense of connectedness, the sense of I am at one with the universe, or God has reached down and touched me in my heart, or in my mind, or in my soul, those senses come and then they go. But the reason for that is that it's all temporary stuff. You needn't worry about it too much. But the point is that you need to move forward from there. And the next step is through realizing that the pleasures of the world, and even the pleasures of spiritual life, or spiritual power, or spiritual connectedness, are transitory, and we move forward. And that's what this path is about. Juan says the Aboriginals believe we were all just a temp dream. Brendine says, but as we are our one awareness, we are all connected. Robin says, moving beyond the spiritual. Yes, as we are all one awareness, we are all connected. But we don't walk around as one awareness. We walk around as individual awarenesses. And that's temporary. Moving beyond the spiritual, no, that's not quite what I mean. But moving beyond the sense of spirituality as something that we're questing for. We are all individuals with the One for the moment. And we fuse with the One at times. Juan says, much like your body, the organs and the cells are each their own world, and yet they are one and the same in us. Matt says, hi Matt. Matt says, moving beyond into what? Beyond the One. Hello, Matt, says Juan. Matt, moving beyond the illusion that the separate self is a reality, which doesn't cause it to cease existing, but simply to realize the falseness of it. Mariana says, okay, like our soul is connected with others, but our physical world is always changing. Yes, our physical sense of ourselves is always shifting and changing. Awareness is. Everything else is changing. Robin, the quest for being okay. Robin asks, we're moving beyond the illusion. Understood, but what's the quest? The quest is for everything to seem better. The quest is for everything to be all right. The quest is for that unsettled energy within us to find some sense of satisfaction. Brandine says, we empty ourselves totally to gain a new way of being one as much as we can, correct? There are more than one way of approaching the matter, Brandine, and certainly emptying oneself is one way of approaching it. Although I think that often it's like trying to bail out a sinking ship. The more that we try to empty, the more stuff comes in to fill in the gap. So in a way, I think the easier method is just simply to place awareness upon it. In the particular way that we're approaching things in this set of path workings, I mean, you're moving more or less naturally in this direction. So we don't really need to discuss it intellectually unless you're really feeling like you're struggling with something. But we're moving more right now in this path that we're about to approach. You're moving more into a space of pure, just loving kindness in which there isn't a need to compete with anybody just simply because there's just a sense of love that's moving outward from within your heart that's very sincere and very genuine. Robin says that she's in the right class, working towards okay. Okay. So Kevin says, when you connect with the God spark in yourself, you become in unity with all. Yeah, I mean, that's a metaphor that I think is very valuable and useful. But I mean, ultimately, God spark and unity and all those things, those are just word concepts that point to things that exist or don't exist. But ultimately there is reality, and the reality is that there is a God. Calling it a God spark is fine. That there is a God spark of actuality within us, and it's not this temporary set of organs and muscles and so forth that move forward and propel the limited ego self through the world. Juan says, in keeping with this illusion concept, I like to think of the Aboriginals once again, in that they believe each phase of human conscious to be another state of the dream time. Simply put, you're just moving into the Creator's next dream. Juan says, the path to being a decent human being. Adding to Juan's statement, Robin says, during this incarnation. And Juan says, yes, each incarnation, exactly. Yeah, and ultimately, if you look at the world, to a large extent, certainly there's ups and downs within it, but I think that everybody's trying their best to be a better person. Each generation, growing and changing into more peaceful, loving, accepting people. If we look at the average person 200 years ago, I think that they were considerably more brutal than we are today. Mariana says, but satisfaction is a never-ending story, because once you achieve it, that desire changes, and it's like a ladder. Absolutely. And so this path is actually about setting all of those things aside. And that's exactly the point of the path, is that, that the different things that we seek out in life aren't actually ultimately bringing us any pleasure or happiness, and moving into the space of pure love. Juan says, even scientists agree that because we cannot fully become the observer, we truly do not know just what reality is, and could just be a big hologram. Yeah, well, it actually is a big hologram. The universe is constructed in our minds. We don't know what it actually looks like at all. Robin agrees with Mariana. Once a person becomes perfect, they want to move on to become more perfect. Smiley face. Juan says, LOL, more perfect. Juan says, it's perfect or it's not perfect. Not sure you can become more perfect. Well, there's not, the perfection that there can be more perfection from is just perfectionism, and it has nothing to do with being okay. It has to do with struggling with some sort of model that one has in one's mind. I can be, I can have $1 million or $10 million or $100 million. But as long as I'm struggling with the concept of prosperity in my mind, it doesn't matter how much money I have, then there's still more that must be had. It's once we sort of drop the model altogether that we can be grateful for whatever resources come to us, but not concerned about, whether we have more than this person or whether we're better than another person. So these are good conversations, good things to think about. But ultimately, if you're struggling with perfection, if you're hoping to be a perfect meditator, or have perfect visualization, or get what you want perfectly, that very struggle is exactly what you need to be setting aside. Kevin says, all that is perceived is within our senses. In fact, the only things that exist to us are all within our senses. Yes. Juan says, please don't misunderstand me. I only strive for perfection. I do not wish or want for it. Brandine says, struggles seem to be what I need to set aside and relax and growth naturally. Struggling is a very typical component of being alive. We need certain resources in order to continue to survive. We need water, food, most human beings, since we are social animals, need friendship, companionship, somebody to speak to. When we don't have those things, we begin to waste away. But as humans, we tend to struggle with other things too. We create models in our minds of how the universe should look. I should be able to do this at this level. I should have these sorts of things in my home. And when we don't have those things, we feel like we're suffering when we're not. We're suffering only in our minds. Mariana poses an interesting statement. Struggling gives us the opportunity to achieve next levels. And I mean, there's a lot of inherent models within there. First and foremost is the model that there's a next level that needs to be achieved. Is there a next level that needs to be achieved? What would it be like if there were no levels? If everything just was? And you were just joyous? Brendine says that would be very different to be just joyous, just to let the growth happen. What if it wasn't really about growth at all? What if it was simply about unraveling a perception that we need to grow or to struggle? Kevin says, if there were no struggling, would we become complacent and unappreciative? Of what? Mariana says, but it brings us the opportunity to achieve our desires, and that way you are joyous. Mariana, isn't it possible that you could just be joyous and attempt to create the things that you'd like to create in your life and not be concerned about whether they worked out exactly the way that you wanted or not, and still be joyous, and still go after them with just as much gusto, but without that feeling of fear that you might fail? Robin says, that's what I try to achieve in meditation, to just be. Such a freeing feeling. Brendine says, unraveling. It is all there within, and allow it to come forth. Juan says, LOL, of what? Love you, Jason. So, these are just ideas. Robin says, nice food for thought in this session with all the questions, Jason. Thank you. Kevin says, I am that I am is a verb set, a state of being. Absolutely. So what makes us happy on a biological basis has a lot to do with dopamine receptors in our brains, getting triggered, and pleasure sensations flowing through our bodies. A lot of the things that create these happy sensations are actually terrible for us. Sugar, narcotics, bread. Robin says, I like to practice just being at times throughout the day. Amazingly, it has given me new perspectives in all kinds of areas of my life. Juan says, you can become anything that way, Kevin. Just I am. Mariana says, but don't you think that when you are out of your comfort zone and you feel vulnerable, it's when you can achieve the most powerful revelations and joy? Well, Mariana, I wholly agree with the essence of where you're coming from. But the very idea that there's a comfort zone and an uncomfort zone is part of the challenge that you're creating for yourself. There's areas where you don't feel like you can naturally go, and so going into them makes you grow. However, if you just simply tore down the idea that there are areas that you can't go, then you would naturally be in those areas, and so you would achieve the same sorts of things without the necessity of the struggle. Robin says, some things outside our comfort zone can be dangerous for us. Sure, I don't think Mariana is suggesting, doing something that would be self-destructive. Juan asked an interesting question. Mariana, when you're at work, do you feel better when comfortable or when in fear of losing your job? I'm sure you do your best when you are made comfortable. On the other hand, Juan, and I don't want to take anything away from Mariana's point of view here. There are a lot of people who feel most productive and comfortable when they have a deadline in front of them. When they feel like I immediately need to accomplish this, or there's going to be repercussions. So some people's neurology is set up that way. It doesn't mean that it's the most healthful way of approaching life, but at the same time, if that's the choice that person's biology wants them to make, there's no real reason to resist it. What I'm actually suggesting is something outside of either of those two models, and that is simply just being okay with things as they are. So Robin loves the devil's advocate play. Mariana says absolutely, comfort gives security. Juan says that response makes me think of the movie Office Space, when the main character reminds HR that one will only work so hard to not lose their job, but that doesn't translate to good work. I do understand your point. My feeling is that if your work isn't something that you'd like to do, that you would be doing, whether you're being paid for it or not, or whether there's someone behind you prodding you forward or not, that you really ought to try and find a different line of work, one that makes you feel more alive. You're spending so much time in your day on your work. Do something that you love. There's a lot of focus in our society on achieving certain things in the material world. And our society is set up so that it's you're in trouble if you don't at least achieve a minimum of those things. It takes resources to live very, in shelter and so forth. One has to have a certain amount of money in order to do that. It's hard to get by without it in this culture. But if it's at the price of constantly feeling agitated, constantly feeling ill at ease, constantly feeling unhappy, perhaps it's not the best job. Still, even within that space, even within the space of doing things that we don't like to do, one does not have to be ensnared in desire for something different. Thanks for stopping by, Matt. We all do need to go out and enjoy the world at some point. But Brendine says, achievement in the material world, yes. But then that translates to the spiritual achievement also. It is balance. Well, that's the thing. Our culture breeds this idea that something needs to be achieved spiritually, that there are spiritual merit badges to be obtained for certain things. And that's not the only way to look at spirituality. Can people think of other ways of looking at spirituality besides trying to become more spiritual than another person, or trying to become more connected with God than we presently are, or become a higher grade in the invisible order? Can you think of other ways of spirituality operating? Juan says, for me it is about becoming comfortable in my own skin. Robin says, does that come back to just being then? Juan says, not becoming so quick to judge my own faults and mistakes. I think to an extent you guys have given some pretty good definitions of another way of looking at spirituality. Another possible way might be opening, yielding, letting go, dropping away. Brendine says it is a pull to make the grade, but you said unraveling. Unraveling, sure. Mariana says meditation. And meditation implies moving to the middle. placing oneself in the middle of things. Juan says removing yourself from the equation. Opening, those are nice, says Brendine. So, the path of Yod. I think the recording brings some clarity to what I'm talking about. It's probably most useful after listening to what we've just been talking about. But certainly there's more that we've been talking about that isn't covered by the recording. So try and carry that with you, or you know, let that be in your awareness as you're moving forward with the recording. And it was nice to see those of you who haven't been here before coming. And I think that's it for today. I'd love to see you all. Hopefully next week I'll have the system going better than it was today. Mariana asked me when my birthday is. It is just a few days away, I think. I agree with you, Juan, that the audio is just fine. And it seems like it doesn't create as many problems. So we may just go over to that route. So thank you guys all for being here.